Welcome to Genuine Life Recovery. We're here to help you and your loved ones overcome addictions and other addiction-related mental health challenges. In this show, we dive into the physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual aspects of addiction, mental health, recovery, family dynamics, codependency, and more. You can listen on your favorite app or at jodystevens.org. Genuine Life Recovery is made possible by great friends like Joshua's Heart in memory of Joshua Brent Moore, bringing hope, love, and awareness to those afflicted by addiction, online at joshsheart.org, and Jody Stevens Productions for commercial voiceover, narration, production, MC, and public speaking, online at jodystevens.org. Welcome back, friends, and today we are talking about the role trauma plays in addiction. We're talking addiction recovery with trauma. We're also going to talk about God's power to heal us through it all. And I'm joined by Mark McNear. He is a licensed clinical social worker. He has a private practice in New Jersey, 30 years of experience in clinical practice, and now he's really focused on helping people who have also had trauma and abuse and addictions in their lives, sharing the hope of healing that he's found in his own life. So we are going to hear some of his story too. Dr. McNear is also speaker, author, his new book, which I read, which is great, called Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. You can find that on Amazon. So Dr. McNear, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jody.
Absolutely. So you are in New Jersey.
Yeah, I'm about an hour from Manhattan. I'm in Northwest Jersey.
Okay, I can hear the Jersey.
Can you?
Yes, I can. I love it. I love it. People would always say to me, I'm from Alaska, they would say, because I do media and stuff, they'd be like, tell her to lose the northern accent. And I'd be like, northern accent? Like, what's that? Like, can you hear like a northern accent in me?
No, but I'm not sure I would because I'm so used to it.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of a mishmash.
Yeah,
where
definitely.
You're from.
Yeah.
Okay. So, tell me, so you're, as a social worker, this is interesting. What types of clients do you see? Do you do individual clients?
I basically work with individuals. Since I went to rehab myself, I have been working with a lot of people who have had trauma and abuse and as a result, addiction. I see some couples and I see individuals mostly, though.
Wow. Okay, that's good. You probably get that question a lot. Like, what's the difference between a social worker and a psychologist and a psychiatrist and things like that. So, wow. Okay. Well, I want to hear your story, but the first thing I want to do is talk to me just a little bit about the effects of unresolved trauma,
sure,
particularly maybe in kids, like on our bodies and our brains. Because I remember when I was a kid, like I had an anxiety disorder and things like that for various reasons. I didn't figure it out till I was about my age. Looking back, I'm like, oh my, but they, because I was diagnosed like dyslexic, it was just like, oh, she's just blanking out, she's stupid. I think we don't, maybe we're better at it now, but I don't think we recognize these things in children.
No. So with kids, a lot of times you see a lot of dysregulated mood. You see a lot of issues with mood, with anxiety and depression and anger. A lot of times you see kids that are acting out. Either, I'd say, Jody, either one extent or the other. Either they're really inhibited and don't say a word, or they're acting out all over the place in the classroom and at home. Sometimes sleeping issues, you'll see. The one that you highlighted with learning difficulties. A lot of kids, and there's been a lot of research that's been done with that now, a lot of kids that are diagnosed with ADHD actually have the high activity level and the low ability to concentrate, things like that, really have their roots in trauma. And so there needs to be a good diagnosis done. The field is really looking into that now.
Yeah, it probably just really depends on your personality. If you're one of those out people, as they say, or the in people, which I was. So I just was really quiet, kept everything to myself, that kind of a thing.
I did
the
too.
one most likely to grow up codependent.
And that's another one you see, and it's usually really polarized, where, Jody, you see people who are really independent
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
people who don't want to rely on anyone for anything, or people that are overly dependent or codependent on individuals.
Yeah, yeah, because when you come out of trauma, you're either going to be very hyper vigilant, right? If you're
Yeah,
that type of
yeah.
person where it's like, can't trust anybody, got to take care of everything myself,
Mm.
which it sounds like it's kind of how you were, or we never learned to make decisions, so we just let people make them for us,
Yeah,
right? I mean, it was
and
probably the extremes, right? You always just see the
yeah.
extreme. I mean, we're all a mix of both, but right, sometimes you get these extremes, right, in recovery.
Yeah, and it's hard to pigeonhole, but that's
Yeah,
a really good way to put it. The extremes, and I have found in my own life things like a dysregulated mood,
yeah.
is really really something that I struggle with. Another thing I struggle with is flashbacks. A lot of flashbacks from the scenes from childhood, and also nightmares. I'll have quite a few nightmares, and they'll be pretty easy to kind of trace back to where they came from,
Yeah,
but they're still very disturbing.
hmm
So I think those are some of the key things that I struggle with.
hmm
Codependency also, that's a big one for me.
Do you still have the nightmares and things like
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Oh
I'm about
gosh.
in recovery now for about 8.5 years, and I still have them. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So you're a therapist, but probably also have to do a certain amount of therapy because that sounds like PTSD,
yeah, yeah.
for
I
the like
actually,
post-traumatic stress
yeah,
that's
I
coming back.
actually, I actually was diagnosed with complex trauma or complex PTSD. Yeah,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
yeah, I'm still in
Gosh.
treatment for it, definitely.
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay. Okay. Well, talk to me about how it all began, kind of your story. I usually like to give people a few minutes before we dive into it. Welcome,
Yeah,
Dr. McNear. Tell us about your story of abuse. We don't mean to
yeah.
make light of it, but,
No, no, no. I understand.
there was abuse, there was trauma,
Hmm.
and then, often, it leads to addiction. I don't propose on this program that it's always that,
Hmm.
but generally there's an underlying issue. So yeah, so I'd like to kind of hear what it was like for you growing up and then what
Yeah, it
that
was.
abuse and trauma led to.
I did poorly as a student.
Mm-hmm.
That was one thing that happened. I think that I was always kind of lacking concentration, and I would have
Mm-hmm.
been one of those kids that would have definitely been diagnosed with ADHD. And in fact, later on in
Uh-huh.
my life, at around 27, 28, I was diagnosed, and I don't think it was an accurate diagnosis, but I was diagnosed with ADHD.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
the home that I grew up in was a very strange home. There was a lot of things that went on, and a lot of traumas that just one thing happened after another. And one
Yeah.
of the things I talk about in the book, when I'm sitting in rehab, and the medication is coming out of my system, and as the
Mm.
medication is coming out of my system, the memories are coming back. Just
Yeah.
one right after another, and I'm just sitting in rehab trying to act normal as they were just bombarding me, and it
Wow.
was not
Mm.
easy. I talk
Yeah.
about the fact that when I was approximately 4 years old, my dad, we were at the dinner table, and my dad force fed me carrots, and
Mm.
I ended up vomiting on the table, and my dad became very irate and picked me up and threw me in the garbage and said, stay there, you're a piece of garbage, that's where you belong. And from there, um, sitting in rehab, all these memories of
Yeah.
sexual abuse came out,
Mm.
and just remembering the horrific things that happened during that period of time, and that was
Mm-hmm.
from around 4 years of age till about 7.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've learned my story, I've kind of figured out some of the timelines, and I think the sexual abuse stopped, and that was traumatic that it stopped because I got attention from my dad, I got affirmation from my dad, but I think that stopped as a result of armed robbery that we had in our home, where 4 men came in with guns. Two of the guys went downstairs with my mom and dad, and two of them stayed upstairs with us. We never woke up during the robbery,
Mm-hmm.
but really that turned the house upside down.
Yeah.
The next day, the house, I can remember the house was filled. The house was filled with policemen, and I can
Mm.
remember people looking at the front page, and we were on the front page of the news. That there had been an armed robbery in this small town. Um,
Wow.
as a result of that, my mom became an alcoholic, and
Oh.
suffered her own trauma. And my dad became very, very paranoid and really struggled a lot, and was just, I can remember him just being so obsessed with wanting to catch the people who did it. And then on on top of all of this,
And here you are, just like nobody probably talks about it.
yeah, I mean,
Unless it's just drama llama or something. So
well,
you're
it was
just
talked
you're
about around us. Everybody
right,
was
but
talking
not
about
like
it.
how you doing, Mark? How are you?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
nothing. Yeah.
yeah, and so, Jody, we and I write this in the book. They took the individuals that came and robbed us, took personal paperwork, and so we weren't allowed to go to school because they had all of our IDs and all of our
Oh gosh.
personal information. So that was scary too. I didn't know exactly why we couldn't go to school, but I knew that it was dangerous and that we couldn't go to school. And so
Wow.
from there, I talk about in the book just how, different things would come about in our family, and I wrote a lot of things down, but not everything down. That there was just
Yeah.
so much trauma throughout,
Yeah. Yeah.
throughout my childhood. I ended up getting in a really serious car accident when I was 19
Oh,
years
geez.
old, and so got hit head on New Year's Eve, and the driver that had hit me head on. He was intoxicated, and so I ended up in the hospital and broke my femur, my right femur, and had pulmonary embolism and almost died. So all of these
Wow.
things were going on, and then the bright spot of that is that I got out of the hospital, and I was kind of like at 19 years old, like there's got to be more than this, and so I
Right.
started searching, and I found a book by Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, and in that book, he talked about getting a Bible and underlining passages in the Bible, and I started doing that, and then I also, it said in the book to go to church, to find a church, and so I found a church to attend. And I can remember I went on a Saturday night. It was a special meeting, and they had a guest speaker, and the preacher spoke on going the second mile. And so I didn't know quite what I was doing, but I was, the preacher gave an invitation, and so I went forward and accepted Christ as my personal Lord and Savior.
Nice.
And so, I see in my life, one pattern that I see is a lot of times there's really dark moments, really tragic moments, but out of it comes wonderful things. And that's kind of why I wrote the book, because all of this trauma and all of these things going on. And so, I wanted to see, I thought God was done with me. I just thought he was finished.
Yeah.
And that was not the case at all. And so he showed up in big ways in my recovery, and just really miraculous ways. That's what I would say, just miraculous ways.
That's beautiful, because, and I always say, God sees the little child. God sees the pain that opened up the addiction. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, he's been around since he's always been around.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we always think, well, he wouldn't really understand. He's done with me. He doesn't get it. And it's like, no, I think,
Yeah.
but we think like he's mad at us.
Yeah,
But then
yeah.
he sees the child crying in their room, the child stuffing their emotions, the child now turning to addiction because they feel unloved, or they don't even feel, or you know what I mean? And God knows that, and he just lovingly wants to restore us. And I'm sure that, so here you're 19, you fall into addiction, you're going through this for another 20, 30 years, whatever, and God's probably by your side.
Yeah,
He's with
looking
you the
back,
whole time, you know?
Yeah, I think looking back, it's really easy to see. When you're in the middle of it, it's not easy to see, but looking back.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so it was actually, I accepted Christ as my personal Lord and Savior at 19, and then felt like I wanted to go into ministry. And so I signed up for Bible college, and again, didn't know what I was doing, but signed up for Bible college, and, started Bible college, and then started having a lot of anxiety. And so I went to a counselor, and she was really, really helpful. And so that kind of turned, I didn't know, I studied to be a pastor, and then decided that I wanted to go to be a counselor, and so changed my track at Bible college and stayed an extra year to have a minor in psychology, and so then went on to NYU to get my master's in social work. And it was during that time that I went to a psychiatrist because I was struggling so much emotionally. And he put me on medications. He put me on something for depression, he put me on something for anxiety, and he put me on something for ADHD. And, taking the medications, it was wonderful because I felt calm, like for the first time in my life. The problem, of course, is that I needed more and more to reach that same level of calm. So through the years, I just took more and more medication to get the same results.
Was it Xanax? Was he giving you like Xanax or opiates or something like that?
Yeah, he gave me benzodiazepines, and then also gave, which would have been like a Xanax, and then also I was given a stimulant for the ADHD.
Oh, okay.
And then also an antidepressant.
Wow. Okay. And so you were using those for how many years?
Oh, about 30 years. Yeah. And so wow. I it was in 2015 I called my psychiatrist and asked her for referrals, and it became really clear to her really quickly that I was abusing the medication, and so she recommended that I go to rehab. Not something that I was looking forward to doing at that time. And so I told her that I would, and so then I talked to my wife, and Debbie was wonderful with it and just so accepting of where I was at, and then had to get in touch with my daughter, and Emily was in Florida at the time. So I had to get in touch with Emily. She was also really wonderful with it. So within a couple of days, I was off to rehab at 55 years of age.
Wow. And how long have you been sober today?
It is 8.5 years, yeah.
Yay!
Yeah. Thank you.
You are a miracle. Wow. Okay, so you're in rehab, and sounds like you were a very functional addict, very professional, very probably made pretty good money, very successful, helping people deal with their trauma, and haven't even dealt with your own. So
no,
this is interesting, especially and I have an MS in addiction counseling, and they're very like, be introspective, all those sorts of things they tell you to do. Were you in denial? Were you just like, I just don't want to deal with it? Like, what was that process for you?
I think,
what was going on?
I think on some level, I felt like I was beyond repair. I knew about some of the trauma that had happened, and some of it I vowed I would never talk about, some of the sexual abuse and what happened during that time. And so I think that, I felt like counseling was really important, and I participated in counseling at different times, but I really do think I got to the point where I just felt like, you know what, I'll just medicate the problems. And I didn't even know, on a certain level, I didn't even know I was doing it.
Yeah.
So there was quite a bit of denial. And so, I think it was a relief when the doctor said go to rehab. It was terrifying, but it was also a relief that somebody saw the pain that I was in.
Well, and it does kind of make sense, because you're pretty much, if you've got like PTSD and stuff, you could compartmentalize that, and it's, from when I read your book, it sounded like anytime you tried to stand up for yourself or say anything, it was like, you're stupid, you're no good, what's wrong with you? So you just kind of, you stuff at an age that, by the time you're older, you don't even remember half this stuff. You don't even, you're what do they call it? You would know as a therapist, you're walking around in a fog almost.
I think my dad was good at convincing me that it actually was my fault, like that I was there was such a problem with me, or that I had such a problem. And so, as I've been able to walk through recovery, I can see, just how traumatized he was with the things that he did to me, or the things that he said to me. I think that you know, Jody, I was always good at coming up with a way to kind of feel better about myself. So, you know, I had gone for my bachelor's, and then I went for a master's, then I went for a second master's, and then I went for my doctorate, you know, and I'm sitting in rehab. And in the first few weeks, I'm thinking like, maybe I'll go for, you know, a degree in addiction. You know, maybe I'll, you know, as if that's what I needed. And really what I needed was to get to know my story and get to learn, you know, kind of how that impacted me. And just to be able to, and I'm still in the middle of it, you know, learning parts of my story and also grieving, you know, learning to grieve.
Yeah. It's such a lifelong process. I mean, I've been sober 18 years and I'm still like learning things, or I'll come back to a dream that maybe I've had like two dreams that I feel were really from the Lord, and one was 20 years ago, and still I'm still learning stuff from that. It's so interesting. It's just that whole sanctification. It's a lifelong process of recovery, and when we're in heaven, we're there.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the verses I love is Paul writes in Philippians, "Be confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you, he will continue it until the day of Christ Jesus." But you know, you're absolutely right. It's that journey of sanctification. You know, each day, one step at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that are listening, it is very frustrating because, you know, initially when you first get saved or find the Lord, you don't understand that. Like, your salvation is instant, but the process of becoming like Christ is lifelong. So you don't have to beat yourself up. It's progress, not perfection. And that's why the steps are so related to the Bible. You go, wow, that's biblical, because they're taken from the Bible, you know. What was recovery like for you? What are some nuggets of truth, or just, are there like one or two memories or things that just really jarred you or resonated with you?
I think, you know, one
probably
thing,
more than that, but
I think the Serenity Prayer really grabbed a hold of me. I'd probably heard it a million times before, but to be in rehab and to be reciting it with other guys, and to really be taking it to heart and looking at, you know, how really broken I was in so many areas, and realizing that I needed to figure out the things that, you know, I could take on, and then the things that, you know, I didn't have the wisdom for, and the things that I needed to just lean on God and to, you know, be able to know the difference between those. And I'm still working on that daily. You know, it's not something that I've arrived at. The other thing, Jody, I think that has become really big for me, that I put in the book, is that the past is not the past when it shows up in the present. You know, that trauma tends to haunt you or come up, you know, and so my body is definitely trying to protect itself from things that it went through earlier in my life, you know, but that, you know, today in 2023, memories of things come up in my body. I feel it in my body. I feel it throughout my whole body.
Wow.
You know, I'll give you an illustration that when I was growing up, when my dad would come home, from work, the garage door would go up. We had electric garage doors, and so the garage door would go up, and I would like just tighten. My heart would start beating.
Yeah.
You know, it would start racing. I'd be afraid, you know, of what would happen. Fast forward, my wife and I, Debbie, buy a house, and it has electric garage doors. And, you know, Debbie comes home. You know, this is when we were first married. Debbie comes home from work. She teaches, and the garage door goes up, and my heart begins to pound, and I have this feeling of dread.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and then I have feelings of shame, and I have feelings of guilt. Like, why should I be feeling this way about my wife coming home? You know,
that's interesting, and I guess you would call those like triggers that we have. And I had a lot of that too. When people would scream or yell or fight or throw things, I'd get this fight flight reaction. And I think too, with the addiction, where, you know, when you start self-medicating, you don't even understand that you're self-medicating a lot of those triggers. And so removing all the alcohol and then understanding like what's happening. And I don't know if this helped for you. For me, I do a lot of, you know, I had a fear of like male authority figures and, you know, all these sorts of things. and I'm just really having to consciously, grieve the process, right? So when it happens, right, grieve it, know what it is. Like one time I just cried all night, even though I knew it wasn't real.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
from there, just going, okay, this was real then when I was 5, but it's not real now.
Yeah, yeah,
Have you
yeah.
found a solution to work through those
You
triggers?
know,
Because, right, if you don't get them and work through them,
you repeat
that's
them.
what's
Yeah,
rooted in the addiction. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? Like, that's
yeah.
what makes you want to.
Yeah, no, and it's the dysregulation. Somebody had once
Yeah.
said to me, good recovery from trauma involves having two like circles on the floor, two hula hoops on the floor, and having your right foot in one and your left foot in the other. The left foot being the past and the right foot being the present, and being able to toggle, like you said, back and forth, and to say,
Yes.
absolutely, this was true, but it's not true now. And to bring, Jody, bring a lot of self compassion, that, we have been through a lot, and so our body is reacting the way it should for what we've been through.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so I think that, and also a lot of self care for me.
Well, and the other thing, talk to me a little bit about how trauma changes your brain. I mean, we don't have to get into neurology or anything, but you think about like when we're little, our brains are forming. They're not even done forming till we're
Yeah.
like 18. And
Like
we've learned all these dysfunctional trauma
yeah,
stuff. And
yeah,
so a lot of times it's, well, why can't you just fix it? Just stop drinking, get better. And it's like you have to actually rewire a lot of that stuff. And it just takes a lot of time talking to safe people. I always say you have to have positive input coming into your eyes and your mind and your brain and your ears to rewire all those neurotransmitters,
yeah,
because that
yeah.
was all formed when you were little. I mean, and so
Yeah,
of
I think
course we're going to
I,
have these reactions.
yeah, I think about Romans chapter 12, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's part
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
process is, realizing that the brain and the limbic part of the brain has been so sensitized toward danger, and it's always scanning. God gave us that so that we would be protected, and so it's always scanning and looking for danger. And it
Yeah.
seems like the research says that for people who have had more trauma, it is even more hypervigilant, and looking for and trying to
Yeah.
protect the
Yeah.
individual. So what I've learned, like in my recovery, is I need to calm my body down in order for my mind to be
Yeah.
calm. And so I have to, step into a lot of self-care and a lot of exercises and stuff like that to
Yeah.
help bring my body to a point where it's more regulated.
Isn't that interesting how so often we have to do the body first,
Yes. Yeah.
It's taken me, I'm 51 years old. I had the worst type of insomnia, like I'd be up for 3 days, things like that. There's this military technique where you tighten and release the muscles, and I'm
Yeah.
just now learning how tight I am. So now every night I conscious, like, and even throughout the day I think about, am I doing this again,
Yeah.
this tightening up. And it's not perfect, but it's helped me fall asleep so much quicker. And I realized for my whole life I've been walking around in that constant state of anxiety, which then
Yeah.
led to panic attacks, but I never even knew it was happening in my shoulders and back and stuff like that,
Yeah, it shows up in the body. It definitely
Mm-hmm.
shows up. Trauma shows up in the body. That hypervigilance that we get, or that obsessive thinking that we have, all of that is all connected.
Wow. That's crazy. So talk to me a little bit about the family dynamics. Are you into that sort of like the rules
Yeah,
in the
sure,
family?
sure. I think that
Um,
there were 3 children in my family.
mhm.
My oldest brother was the hero. He was the
Okay.
one that was put up on a pedestal. My sister was pretty much the ignored one, the one that was
The
kinda,
lost child?
yeah, the lost child, yeah. And
Yeah.
and
For
then,
those of you, let me just interrupt real quick. For those of
sure,
you that are like, what are they talking about? So I think in every family we adopt roles. in addicted families and abusive families, it's kind of rigid. There's these sort of rigid roles, and they're not really based on authenticity, right? They're kind of based on survival. And in families with severe addiction and codependency, they've found certain roles like the hero, the lost child. That was kind of me. My brother, who died of his addiction, sadly, he was like Robin Williams, like the mascot, like so funny, but the one that could see all the BS. So they kind of have developed these roles, right? And I we can play the roles interchangeably, and some people in the therapeutic world believe in it. Some think it's hogwash. For me, I've seen it and I believe it, and it sounds like you subscribe to that too. So anyway, carry on with what you were saying.
So my brother was definitely the hero of the family. He was named after my dad and put on a pedestal, and that had its consequences, definitely. So all the roles, just for listeners to hear, all the roles that are there, all of them have a price to pay, so my brother was the hero. My sister, I see her as being the lost one or the forgotten one. And then I was the one that joked around a lot, but also the scapegoat, the one that everything was dumped on, and so going through recovery and seeing this and just seeing how it played in my family and how it didn't work. It was so dysfunctional, but how it, each member of the family was dependent on the other member of the family to do their thing so that this dysfunctional family could, coexist.
Yeah, and they call that, what they call it is like, as and this, doctors, like homeostasis, and what that means is like the images of the kaleidoscope, and then if one piece moves, it disrupts everything. And so a lot of times you see people come in with addiction, and they're the ones that are trying to break out of the dynamic, and we see that sometimes their family, sadly, is the one holding them back because they want to keep the dysfunction going, because everybody plays their role and it serves their role. If you're the codependent mom, you kind of get this control of manipulating people and places and things, and so there's something we get out of it, but it's also like what happens at home stays at home, and don't talk, don't feel, and so we play these roles to keep things balanced, right? Dad's, if he's coming home, he's going to be drunk, got to walk on eggshells, don't do this, don't do that. So then we learn all these terrible coping strategies, right? And then we get out, grow up and get into the real world, and we're like, oh, this is not working very well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So you came to the Lord at 19. Now, through your recovery, did your relationship with the Lord change? Kind of what happened through that, and what has He been working with you on through, from 19 and then you were 55?
Yeah, Jody, I see that He stepped in a big way, from the time that I went to rehab, and, just showed up with so much grace and so much mercy and so much love, and didn't see it right off the bat, because I was in so much pain. But looking back at it now, I have such a different relationship with Him, and I would say much more genuine, where I can talk to Him about anything. Whereas I think that when I first got saved, it was kind of like, no, this is the right way to do it. This is the right way, to pray. This is the right way. And even in interacting with the Word of God, it's become really different for me. I really struggle with concentration due to the trauma, and so just finding creative ways to be able to interact with His Word has been really, really good for me.
And what are some, we were talking about just relaxation stuff, maybe mindfulness. What are some things that you do on a daily basis to regulate not just the physical but the mental and emotional impact of trauma and the PTSD?
I try to journal every day. I try to color, pretty frequently. Do mindfulness coloring, doing exercises. as far as exercise physically or walking. I find that walking is really helpful for me. So I at least try to walk 1 hour a day.
Yeah.
A lot of friends, speaking with friends, getting outside also, like with walking, is really, really helpful for me. Doing body scans, where I'll start at the top of my head and scan through my body and just notice where the tension is really, really helpful. Playing with putty, putty is really great. They have a type of putty. It's Aaron's putty on Amazon, and you can find it in the stores too. And it's just it's kind of like silly putty, but it's more of it. And so I have found that that's really helpful to begin to relax, to do that. Church is really helpful for me, being able to go to church. Just beefing up self-care, drinking a lot of water every day. Just things that, like learning, because there's been so much harm to my body, bringing kindness. And that's one of my verses that I absolutely love in scriptures, Romans 2:4. It is the kindness of God that leads to change, or it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance. And so that was my whole idea with recovery is, to be relentless at being gentle.
Wow. I love that. I love that. There's a part that we play, but God is there so lovingly, just guiding us along.
Yeah.
I love that about the Lord. I know when I was in the midst of, I found the Lord and then continued drinking for 5 years, but he was still there, he was still there in the midst of it, just gently waiting for me to want to get well, which is one of the scriptures that you also mentioned, which it's not as sweet as some of the scriptures, but I love this one. And I think in recovery, we look at it in a different way, those of us that have been through recovery, where in John 5:6, where Jesus says to the guy at the pool of Bethesda, I think, right? And,
yes.
and he says, do you want to get well? I mean, it's such a beautiful story, because he's wooing him in, he's giving him the choice, but he's also kind of recognizing that bone of self-pity, that's like, well, somebody else is, which that was the thing for me, was the pity. Oh, so when I read that, I laughed. I mean, I read it the way, I don't know, I think the way it was meant to be read. A lot of people are like, really? And I'm like, that's Jesus calling him out, Yeah,
and yet in such a kind way. I have found in my journey of recovery, God has been so kind to me, and showing up and just providing, the right type of counseling at the right time. I've continued to be in counseling and to continue to work on the trauma that I've experienced, or the complex trauma, but just how kind he's been in providing things for me all along the way.
Yeah. For those of you that don't know, in that scripture, the man is by these healing waters, and he's been there 38 years, and he asks Jesus, Jesus asks him if he wants to get well, and he kind of gives these excuses like, for 38 years, every time I try to go down there, someone else comes in front of me, and so he's kind of just making excuses. So then the Lord just basically says, do you want to get well? Which causes him to think, and so anyway, I love that. I love that. It's so good. What would you say to people, Dr. McNear, who are angry at God, maybe for the trauma, the abuse that they've suffered?
I would say I've been there. I know what that's like, and it's not something that surprises the Lord. And you don't have to feel shamed or guilty about that. You just have to start working on the process of healing. And part of that is just having people that you can talk to about the pain that you've experienced, and being able to, and I talked about this the other day in a podcast. I don't see forgiveness being like a photograph, like one picture and that's it. It's more like a movie. And it progresses. And there's times when I feel it again in my body, where it comes up, and I can feel the anger toward my dad, or I can feel the anger toward my mom, and I just have to go back to the tools that I've been given to kind of work through, and to reach toward, you know, maybe a further forgiveness, a fuller forgiveness for my mom and dad. But it's not easy. I don't want people to hear it and think like I'm saying, it's one step and that's it. No, it is a process. It's not a procedure.
Yeah, and it definitely sometimes feels like two steps forward, one step back, and
Yeah.
I find days where I'm just like, Lord, why won't you take this? Like,
Hmm.
why won't you fix this? For
Yeah.
me, it's always the insomnia, but you know, so often, and I know for my husband, it was like, well, because he's been sober
Hmm.
21 years, and
Hmm.
it was just like, well, why can't you just quit? Why isn't
Hmm.
Jesus enough? And a lot of times the church just does that,
Hmm.
and they don't really mean harm. They just don't understand. Not
Right,
all
and
the
it's
time. And I love Dr. Henry Cloud said something. He said something about how occasionally someone could be, God could heal someone from years and years of trauma, but he said it's just very rare. It just doesn't happen
yeah,
that way. Does that mean God couldn't? It doesn't, but the Bible says all of creation is groaning under the
yeah,
sin. So
yeah.
so that's our mind, our body, our neurons, our brains, and
Hmm.
so it's this lifelong process.
Hmm.
And I think we need to it's helpful to understand that, because otherwise a lot of times you can go into the church and feel shamed. Like I went
Hmm.
to AA before church because I'm like, well, I gotta clean myself up before I
Yeah.
go into church, because
And
Jesus is supposed to be enough to fix it all, and
there's so many now there, and I agree with you 100%. There's so many good ministries and people like Dr. Cloud and others
yes,
that are coming out and saying, what, it's not that easy. It takes
yeah,
time. You didn't get there overnight, and you're not going to be healed overnight. It takes time.
right, right. But we know that God is walking along with us. Did the trauma impact your relationship with the Lord?
I think so. Yeah. Now, I don't think it does as much, but I
Mm-hmm.
definitely think that my trauma caused me to be very performance oriented. That I got
Yeah.
to do this and I got to do this and I got to do this, and if
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
all of that, then I'll be accepted by him. And I got to rehab, and
Become a Mormon, and right,
yeah,
that's what you
it's
were doing.
yeah, it was like,
No.
if I do this right and if I do that right and if I do this right, he'll
Yeah.
accept
Yeah.
me. And that's not the
Oh
gospel. That's not the good
no.
news. The good news is, every day I fail, and every day
Yeah.
he's there with grace and mercy and love
Yeah.
and just acceptance.
Yeah.
It's that I can't do it. That's the gospel, but that he does do it.
Right. Right. Isn't it interesting that we get into all this performance and then we're reminded, oh wait, I can't do it. The Bible says
Yeah,
I can't do it.
yeah,
I
yeah,
always say step one, instead of admitted we were powerless over alcohol or addiction, our lives had become unmanageable, I say admitted we were powerless over sin,
yeah,
that our lives had become unmanageable, because then that's everybody. There is no stigma, like that's
yeah,
everybody, you know.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Talk to me just about your book, who you wrote it for, how we can get into contact with you, and all those sorts of things.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So the book is Finding My Words: A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. People can pick that up on Amazon if they're interested in it. The book actually has 3 parts to it. The first book, the title of the book, Finding My Words. The first part of the book is Finding My Words, and then the second part of the book is Speaking My Words, and then the third part of the book is Embracing My Words. And so I wrote it for people who are struggling with addiction. I wrote it for people who are struggling with trauma, and I wrote it for people who are married to people or who are around people who are struggling with those
Yeah.
things, that they could have a kind of an inside look at what my journey was like and is like. And if people want to get in touch with me, they can go on Google and just type in markmcnear.com, markmcnear.com, and my website. There's a place there where they can email me, and I'll be glad to get back to them.
Okay, awesome. Mark, thank you for writing the book. I really enjoyed it, and I just love how you openly share all the things that you went through in the healing process. definitely get the book. It's only like, I don't know, I think it was $7 or something. I mean, it's super affordable and very much worth the read. So be sure and go to his website, check out the book. It's awesome. Mark, Dr. McNear, thank you so much for
Jody,
being here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, friends, for listening to Genuine Life Recovery, playing on your favorite app or on my website at jodystevens.org. It's JODIESTEVENS, jodystevens.org. There you can check out my podcast, blog, recovery coaching info, speaking, and more. Check it out.